Now it is my great pleasure to present this evening's panelists, starting with my right with Tom SUGRUE, who is the David Boies Professor of History and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania and Director of the Penn Social Science and Policy Forum. And to his right, Robert Inman, Richard King Mellon Professor of Finance at the Wharton School, and to his right, Gilles DURANTON, Professor of Real Estate and Chair of the Real Estate Department at the Wharton School. And last is Jeremy Nowak, who's Chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia's Board of Directors, President of J. Nowak Associates, and Interim Director of ArtPlace. You will find more detailed biographies of each participant in your program, but trust me, these are the leaders in their field, and we are delighted to have them with us. We invite you all to engage with us on Twitter using the hashtag #LessonsFromDetroit. That's hashtag #LessonsFromDetroit. So now let me get started, and I will ask a question to Tom. How did Detroit get here, Tom?
It's a long story, and I can recommend a book. But seriously, though, the Detroit fiscal crisis has been long in coming. In many respects, it dates back to the supposed boom years of the post-Second World War II period, when Detroit was at its peak of population, when the city was the center of arguably the most important industry in the United States and maybe the world, the auto industry. Between 1948 and 1963, Detroit lost 120,000 jobs. Its population peaked in 1950 and began a long and steady decline from the 1950s right up to the present day. The loss of jobs in Detroit proved to be devastating for the city's financial base. The impact wasn't necessarily visible at the outset, but over time it had negative consequences for the provision of public services in the city, primarily because the tax base of Detroit began to erode. At the same time, Detroit went from being a predominantly white to a majority African-American city. It was a metropolitan area riven by intense racial conflict. And that racial conflict proved to be very complicated for a city that was beginning to suffer economically and to deal with the implications of the decline in its tax base. Namely, Detroit faced intense hostility from the ring of almost all-white suburbs surrounding it and from the state legislature in Lansing in Michigan, both of which put up lots of obstacles to the city finding additional resources to be able to provide services for its residents. Over the course of this period, Detroit grows increasingly poor. It's a working class city, and as the population becomes eventually majority African American by the early 1970s, it's a population that's overwhelmingly working class and poor. That population is shrinking, and as the population ages and gets poorer, the demand on city services continues to grow, and the city's revenue base continues to decline. The 60s, the 70s, especially with the rise of international competition in the auto industry and the globalization of autos, the 1980s and 1990s proved to be very grim in Detroit, despite efforts by the city to revitalize its downtown and attract new investment. Many look at Detroit's fiscal crisis and blame African-American leadership. That's one of the most conventional explanations, and one hears it in Detroit and in much of the national media. Or one hears the Democratic Party being blamed for creating a bloated public employee workforce in the city, for creating a very generous pension system that proved to be very hard to sustain over time. Detroit did have a large public employee workforce, one that grew, especially important for the city's growing African-American population as its blue-collar workforce began to decline. But Detroit began as early as the early 1990s to shrink the size of its municipal workforce. It dropped by about half between the early 1990s and the present. However, municipal employees and retirees are living longer, and the pension benefits in Detroit, while not by any means exceedingly generous, proved to be increasingly burdensome in a city that was relying more and more on a handful of casinos that attracted a mostly regional base, a handful of corporations that relocated in downtown, and a shrinking retail and industrial presence in the entire 140 square miles of the city. Finally, we have to deal with the fact that Detroit is a city that is huge geographically with a population that is quite small. The city peaked at 2 million in 1950 or the early 1950s. The official 1950 census said 1.85 million. Today, it's about 700,000, spread out over 140 square miles. The city's infrastructure, like that of many big industrial cities, is groaning under old age. The city has closed schools. It's had a very difficult time keeping parks open. It's had a very difficult time providing even the most rudimentary city services. You may have heard bandied about in the media the fact that it takes nearly an hour for police to respond to an emergency call in the city of Detroit. Firefighting is likewise compromised. So we're at a crisis, at a moment when a city, having seen much of its economic base disappear, seeing its population shrink dramatically and grow increasingly poor, face the long-term consequences of changes that have been 50 or 60 years in coming. Ultimately, and we'll leave this to some of our other panelists, one of the fundamental questions that the bankruptcy raises is who is going to, in the restructuring that's going to occur in the next few years, bear the costs of Detroit's $15 to $18 billion deficit. Will it be the pensioners of the city of Detroit, retired public employees whose pension, the municipal workers' average pension is $19,000, not exactly a get rich and live high on the hog in your retirement. For firefighters and for police, it's about $31,000. Many of them do not have Social Security. So we're not talking about a pension system that's particularly generous to city employees, but the costs of maintaining it, as well as debt service and many of the other issues that Detroit faces, continue to be serious ones. So that, in a nutshell, is how we got to where we are.
And where we are is a fiscal crisis, and there is probably no better person around, and I mean that in in the Mid-Atlantic, national, than Bob Inman on fiscal challenges. Bob, what is your view on where Detroit fits in the fiscal crises of cities in general, long run, short run?
Well, I comment to the students in my class that the beauty of living in Philadelphia is I've had 3 or 4 of these things to work my way through and think about over time. And Detroit's is clearly, without question, I think comparably, probably the most serious of any major city. As those of you who have been with me in Philadelphia in the 80s and the 90s, and then yet again in the most recent 2007 period, we're small potatoes compared to what is happening in Detroit. I think the kind of thing, Susan, I'd like to spend a few minutes on is sort of if and when this workout that Tom alluded to, that is divvying up the obligations out there that need to be paid or forgotten, once that's done, what could one think about in terms of a new fiscal order in some fundamental sense that gives the city, meaning the folks in the city and the economic location, that is the geographical location called Detroit, a fighting chance to be a viable and new location for the families and potentially new families and firms that would move in. I think to find an answer to that question, you first want to ask how in the heck did they institutionally get into this mess? I think Tom's given you a sense of what the fundamentals are that lie behind the problems. But cities have, as organizations, have very many different ways of borrowing money. And as things get tight, and if no one's watching, and if the incentives are so aligned, and I'll talk a little bit about what those incentives might be, the opportunity to borrow for cities is really widespread and fairly easy to manage. And I'll just mention 3 of them quite quickly. Tom mentioned underfunded pensions. Pension funds in cities and states, as we know the problem is quite widespread, are defined benefit pension plans rather than what all of us probably have, which are defined contribution. You get under defined contribution, you get back what you put in. Under defined benefit, you get a promise. And defined benefit is basically a promise to pay a fraction of your salary when you retire. those who manage defined benefit plans, if they do it wisely, are supposed to put money aside every year. Roughly the order of magnitude is 10% of the salary. Put it in a bank account, let it accrue, and then in 45 or 30 or 40 years, when the person retires, there's enough money to pay them the promised pension. Cities, and Detroit in particular, have not put money into the pension plan. So what they're effectively getting, if you'll take my 10% as a reasonable estimate, is you're getting a $50,000 employee for $40,000 bucks. They're going to work for you for $50,000, a 10% promise that you don't keep, and a $40,000 salary. So you're getting a subsidized employee. That's a great way of borrowing money for the future, or burden against the future. The second way, which is, I think, familiar perhaps to my son had a Visa card and a MasterCard, and devised this clever, to me anyway, approach of using the one to pay off the other. Not exactly wise. I was sort of the bankruptcy judge in that particular ruling. I'll tell you who bore the burden of those unfunded liabilities. It wasn't me. But the bottom line is cities can roll over debt. They basically can do things like run a deficit this year, roll it into next year's budget, pretend you're going to pay it off, and roll it over again into another year's budget, and essentially keep doing that. So you can roll over short-term debt. Another approach that is often common is, well, I promise I'm going to do this. I'm going to borrow long-term. I'm going to borrow for a bond for 10 years, and I tell the investors that I'm going to build a bridge that has a nice high rate of return to it, and the bridge is going to cost the price of the bond. The problem is I put that money in a fund, and I build my bridge, but I only build 80% of the bridge that I actually plan to build, or I borrow 120% of a 100% bridge. The short being that I have cash sitting around that I can then extract and use to pay for current expenses. So I borrow money through the bond market, I underfund my pension, and then the third way, which has something to do with the very unique characteristic of what public infrastructure is all about. In contrast to a machine on a plant floor that starts to grind and whine and slow down when it is not taken care of, bridges and roads and sewer systems keep functioning until they collapse. The bridge over the Mississippi River in Minneapolis-St. Paul is a perfect example of this. But when I was living in West Philly, we literally had, I can't remember the street, but 48th and Walnut just collapsed because Mill Creek, I think, runs under all of that, and they didn't take care of the creek, and it literally just created a hole in the middle of the street. Well, what cities can do, particularly mayors and politicians, is say, next year is when I'm going to repair the bridges, the roads, and the infrastructure, and keep putting it off, hoping that nothing collapses under your watch, and then get out of town. So all three of those, underfunded pensions, rolled over debt, and an infrastructure that basically is in decay and close to dysfunctional, are problems that Detroit has faced. The incentives that create that environment are the things that we hopefully will be able to check in the future. And it's this: very short time horizons in a world that demands long-term thinking. And who has those short-term time horizons? Well, I'll suggest politicians who serve 4 to 8 years, get out of Dodge before the problems come home. Renters often have very, very short time horizons in cities in which they live, not the 10 or 15 years of property owners, but closer to 4 to 5 years. And though they may be there a long time, poor families have what economists call very high short discount rates. They need money now. They need services now, and they don't have the income to pay for it. So the incentive structure, as you can think about it, align in Detroit to favor these kind of debt strategies. Going forward, the question is what to do about it. And I'll make 2 suggestions. First is control the borrowing. That's an absolute, once they sort out who gets what with what little assets remain, think about the new future Detroit. The first thing you're going to have to do is control the borrowing. States have things called balanced budget rules. Well, they tend to be pretty poorly enforced. They work off of something called prospective budgeting. Send me a balanced budget, I'll put it on the shelf, thank you very much, goodbye. What we want is retrospective balanced budgeting. I'm going to watch you 4 or 5 times during the year, and if you're running in arrears, I'm going to ask you to raise your taxes or cut your spending. Most states do not do that. I don't know the details of Michigan, but my suspicions are it's prospective. Those balanced budget rules really don't have a whole lot of bite in most instances. So what I'm going to suggest is PICA. Something that you have a constant watchdog operation, paying close attention to the budget. I would argue that the best thing in some sense for the finances of the city of Philadelphia out of the 1990 financial crisis was PICA. It's the gorilla in the closet. It gives the mayor the cover he or she needs to be tough in budget situations, and something like that I think would be an important part of Detroit's future. The other thing I will argue for is something to do with the incentives, a closer matching of interests, economic interests, with services provided. And I'll just throw out an idea which I find personally quite attractive because I'm an economist. I love a competition. I love guys who have to worry about putting back benefits that match the taxes you put in. I'm going to recommend to you, and were I to have the opportunity, to the folks restructuring the financial structure of Detroit, business improvement districts and neighborhood improvement districts. Turns out you can do almost everything you want to do in the way of public services with 10,000 people. You do not need to have 800,000 people to provide services efficiently. So it's quite possible that Detroit could be divided up to a network of neighborhoods, a foundation funding for base levels, and then allow neighborhoods on their own resources to pay for additional services, getting a much closer mapping of responsibility, politics, and service provision. So I'm going to be a big fan of business improvement districts and neighborhood improvement districts. So a combination of PICA, BIDS and NIDS strikes me as a potential foundation for Detroit going forward. And I'll say this only by way of setting up my 2 colleagues on my right, who are experts on this. Public finance sets the background, but it doesn't solve the problem. The problem is private economic development, how to get businesses to collect in Detroit once again, and to provide the kind of job opportunities that the residents of Detroit will need going forward.
Lots of good points, and some points I think people are going to definitely want to discuss. We will have time for full discussion after these initial comments among the panel and then from the audience as well. But in short, what I hear from you, Bob, is NIM 2, not in my term of office. But NIM 2 has been around for quite a while, and it, of course, is across all cities, yet Detroit has obviously collapsed and it's collapsed now. What are the short and long-term economic forces, Gilles, that bring us to this point?
Okay. So I'm an economist. I'm generally a pretty optimistic person. But on Detroit, I'm very, very down. I'm very negative. So I'm going to give you lots of reasons to be, at least 3 important reasons to be quite pessimistic about Detroit. So I think the first part of the story is Detroit, circa 2000, was a pretty unusual place in the sense that it had lots more manufacturing than the American average. Whereas manufacturing has by and large disappeared from most large US cities. And to make things worse, this manufacturing was concentrated around one industry, which is obviously the car industry. This industry is about as bad as it gets. I mean, maybe the photographic industry in Rochester is a worse example, but the car industry in Detroit is bad because this is an industry that's being hit by international competition big time. That's an industry that has been, in a way, amazingly successful. We are able to produce so many more cars with far less labor. So this is great for us, but we only buy so many cars. So it means that employment in the industry is going down and going down again. And to make things even worse, even though the industry has kept some strength in North America, it has moved away from Detroit. It has moved south, clearly, but it also has moved north to Canada, which has retained a lot of employment in the industry. Detroit has lost it all. So it means that Detroit, during the 2010 years, even before actually the long recession, has been hit by a very, very strong and negative shock. So you could say, okay, the shock is over and we can start afresh. The problem is that those shocks, they tend to last for a long time. They do not clear just like this. because there's a pretty bad dynamics at play here, which has been put in evidence by my colleague Jojo with Ed Glazer, where there's a negative shock, people start leaving, and when people start leaving, the city becomes really, really cheap. You can buy a house for $10,000. Everything becomes really, really cheap because land becomes really, really cheap. As a result, lots of people stay, and they stay despite a really, really bad labor market. And it's only when basically their properties start collapsing that they go away. So it means that those shocks basically take whatever 20, 30, 40, 50 years to clear. So this was a really, really strong shock. So Detroit has been hit historically by a series of shocks, but the last one was about 10 years ago, and that will take a long, long time to clear, unfortunately. So, and that's going to persist until all the properties reach the end of their shelf life. That will take still for a very long time. My second reason for not being greatly optimistic is the international experience is not encouraging. So Detroit reached its peak like many manufacturing American cities circa 1950. To get a little bit more perspective on that, let's go to England, where the manufacturing cities hit their peak circa 1920. So you have the seven dwarfs of northern England. So you had London and the seven dwarfs, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, Newcastle, Sheffield, and Nottingham, who started declining literally at the onset of the 1920s. So that's 30 more years, and that's a pretty cohesive group of cities who started declining. They haven't come back. So in 5 or 6 of those cases, decline has been stabilized. There's been a little bit of a comeback of Liverpool and Leeds, but it's been a comeback like the comeback of Pittsburgh here. Nothing spectacular. Like Liverpool is still whatever 20 or 30% its population of 1920. So it has stopped with the hemorrhage, but we're talking more than that. And some places like Liverpool, who like Detroit, have been slower to take the measure of their problems, have suffered from slightly worse governance than the others, and so on and so forth. They're still struggling, they're still declining. And we're talking about here nearly 100 years of decline. So unfortunately, this is a sad story. England started talking about a north-south divide 50 or 60 years ago, at a time when the manufacturing belt in this country was booming. So we have 20 or 30 more years of history in England, and this is not boding well for Detroit. My third reason for not being terribly optimistic is the nature of what is making cities, what we call agglomeration economies, might be changing. The comparative advantage of Detroit, historically, was proximity to inputs for the car manufacturing, like tires in Youngstown, Ohio, and all the parts producers for the car industry. In turn, being there because it's close to natural resources, coal in particular. Those things no longer matter. They no longer matter at all. The cost of shipping those items anyway has become really, really low. And what seems to matter for cities to work today is proximity to smart people and proximity to good consumption amenities. Unfortunately, the skill base of Detroit, which clearly was there in 1950, but has been eroded. And unlike us in Philadelphia and other places like Baltimore, they did not have great universities or nexus of universities, colleges, and everything to sustain the skill base. As a result, the most skilled fraction of the population left Detroit is not coming back. Natural amenities in Detroit, that's a hard proposition. I mean, the climate is awful. Well, I lived in Toronto for 7 years, so I know what I'm talking about. Detroit has also suffered from particularly bad governance. And my colleague, Georgette Phillips, is making the argument also that despite the decline, they've kept a very tight zoning system which prevents flexibility, which prevents multi-use. And when things are shrinking, you want to bring the residents closer to retail, you want to bring retail and production closer together, and so on and so forth. And in Detroit, this is proving to be, or this is not happening. So all of those things are telling me that Detroit, the situation is not great, and unfortunately, it's bound to remain. It's bound to remain sad for a long time. Put slightly differently, if you look at the engines of urban growth that economists have looked at, there's roads, there's amenities, there's skills, there's entrepreneurships and small firms, and there's good luck. So Detroit has roads, like the US interstate system was built to converge towards Detroit back then, and it may get good luck, but it's not that frequent.
Before I turn to Jeremy, at one point I heard you say, Gilles, that it's going to take a long time for this problem to clear. But I actually didn't see you identify any positive clearing mechanism. Correct?
So the clearing comes from basically the slow decay and disappearance of the housing stock that actually makes people leave.
Oh, okay.
So what we see in the
So
data
complete
is very-
abandonment is the goal as opposed to pockets of abandonment.
Yeah.
Okay, so more to discuss, but Jeremy, any hope here? Help us.
So it's rare I get to be the optimistic, hopeful person on the panel. So I'm relishing the role. So
Okay.
let me
Please,
say
take it away.
a few things about that, and then come back a little bit to what will be a very painful workout, which I think is actually a watershed moment nationally, not just as it relates to Detroit. It certainly has affected the cost of capital in Michigan because of the role of the state in this. But so let me. I agree with what was said.
Jeremy, I'm sorry, that went very fast, but I think it's profound. Step back. What is the watershed moment?
The watershed moment is really the scale of the bankruptcy. So the only bankruptcy that's anywhere close to this was Jefferson County, Alabama, which happened 2009, 2010. And Jefferson County, if I remember, had about $4 billion in liabilities, with a population that's actually not too different than Detroit. It's about 650,000, something like that. And it has worked its way very painfully through Chapter 9. So Chapter 9 is the municipal bankruptcy code, which is different than other bankruptcy codes. And that is proven to be very difficult. And in fact, somebody I know who's dealt with it they were just meeting with Moody's and Fitch and S&P recently this summer to talk about their plans for getting out. So in comparison, with the same population, Detroit has a debt load of somewhere between $18 and $20 billion in comparison to the $4 billion. And so just to bring up to date quickly, since I got on this track, and then I'll get back to what's hopeful, is that Detroit, so they applied for Chapter 9. Then, of course, understandably, unions, pensioners, and others have objected to that on the grounds that it doesn't meet the criteria for bankruptcy. And so this will play out over a period of time. The federal judge will have to make a decision. I would recommend the report. When the receiver was appointed, they put together a very, very good management report that gave basic data, which I'm sure you could get on the website for the receiver. And the data is actually pretty dramatic. But as Jim Collins says, you start with looking at the cold facts and the brutal facts, as Collins would say, and I think at least we're at a place where people are looking at the brutal facts. So I would say we'll see how it plays out. And I'll get back to that, but let me try to do something hopeful a little bit, and then I'll get back to the workout. So I agree with what was just said about the problem of not only population loss, but how dispersed the population is and how inefficient that is from a public service perspective. There are some, and the only way to get around that is not to get around that by saying you live here, you live. I mean, we can't do that, right? We have property laws, we have a Bill of Rights, so that's not going to happen, right? We don't want to do that. But there are attraction strategies, and I would say that in both parts of the downtown and in Midtown Detroit, there are some really significant attraction strategies that are going on right now, using employer-assisted housing, much as Penn and Drexel and others have done, and is actually working a little bit. So the population of those very, very small submarkets around Midtown, which is where Wayne State is, Henry Ford Medical Clinic, a few other schools, and health facilities are, and they're beginning to have some effect in terms of a reconcentration, or at least building a base there. Interestingly, that is run by a business improvement district, and so it's exactly says a lot about the role of the business improvement district. Most of the money that's in are from the not from businesses in the private sense, but they're from the large nonprofits, the hospitals and the universities. But what they do, of course, what a business improvement district does is, to the extent to which they're allowed, and they vary greatly, there are about 1,000 of them around the country, there's 70 alone in New York City. We couldn't really think of Center City, Philadelphia without, we couldn't imagine its revitalization without the Center City district. They add a significant amount of value to basic public goods, to basic amenities, and I'd say that that has worked pretty effectively over the last several years in Midtown and downtown. Interestingly, in downtown, the land has become so cheap that money's coming in and starting to buy it. And there are some interesting developments going on there that I think are worth noting that won't hit the data yet. But there is a pretty robust industrial design sector, and a little bit of a technology sector. And I know it sounds funny to say that, but high-end manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, while it doesn't create lots of jobs, is a technology-driven business, of course. And there's a very robust art scene in Detroit. This will sound strange to those of us that don't think of the narrative in that way, but it's actually an extraordinarily vibrant art scene of young people. And I wouldn't be surprised, the Philadelphia population numbers showed a leveling off in 2010, but all the growth was between people, and if you take those demographic and you broke it down, the growth was between people between the ages of 22 and 34. In fact, Philadelphia lost a similar amount of population for people between the ages of 5 and 17, i.e. people who needed schools. And at the same time, Philadelphia continued actually to lose, I guess nobody's looked at the numbers, so it hasn't hit the papers. It continued to lose people between 35 and 55, which is sort of prime productivity age for people that are working. I wouldn't be surprised, actually, if Detroit began to see a bump in the 22 to 34 cohort. And I know it sounds funny, and you never want to, I won't be back to, prove it one way or the other, but I am reminded that in Seattle in 1971, there was a giant billboard that said, "The last person to leave Seattle, turn off the lights." Mm-hmm. And that in the 1970s and 1980s, Boston was always on the most distressed cities list that anyone put together. So I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about the lack of diversification in Detroit, but there are sort of examples of these turnarounds. I would have used Turin if I wanted to give the positive example of something that was a pretty not very diverse economy in Italy, and then has had a really, I think in many ways, a significant turnaround. So if from the kind of community level, base level, if you want Detroit to, if you're saying what are the place-based things we can do, or what are the people-based things we can do, there are sort of 4 or 5, that are logical. The one thing is you've got to create these attraction strategies only in the places where there is some market traction, right? So you've got to build from strength. And there are several places in Detroit where, in fact, you can do that, several sub-markets. The second is you do everything you can to invest in and encourage this small but pretty energetic technology and design and arts group in terms of building. By the way, I should say as an aside, the Great Detroit Museum of Art is actually owned by the city. And so its art collection has been assessed at about $4 billion. And it would be on the table, theoretically, in a Chapter 9 bankruptcy, which would be just, terrible. I don't know if you've ever been. It's a wonderful museum. Because of the problems of Detroit governance, and there have been real problems, and I know Mayor Bing, I think he's actually done everything he could. I think he's a good guy. He's overwhelmed by the situation. I knew the last mayor. He was not such a good guy. And there have been a string of unfortunate. I mean, it's not Illinois, but I mean, you know, it's got its issues, right? It doesn't have 3 consecutive governors indicted, but it's pretty good. And so there's actually an extraordinary amount of federal money that was supposed to go to Detroit that has been held back. So if you can get governance straightened out, why I won't do anything to settle debts, there are federal resources that have been held back that could be invested in Detroit. So that's one thing. The human capital issue is going to drive pretty much everything. So I was just playing with numbers in America's largest cities, and I was looking at ratios in cities between people who had a BA or higher versus adults who had less than a high school diploma. So in Seattle, which does the best now, there are 8 adults with a BA or higher for every 1 adult without a high school diploma. In Detroit, it's about 0.5 to 1. By the way, in Philadelphia, it's only about 1.5 to 1. So Philadelphia, from a workforce, and in Baltimore, similarly, a little bit better than Philadelphia. But from the perspective of workforce capacity, Philadelphia and Baltimore are much closer to Detroit than they are to Seattle, right? I mean, now you can take out Center City and say, well, if you look at those numbers, but I mean, you can't just take out Center City. It doesn't work, right? So this is a pretty dramatic and long-term thing. There are a few good things going on in Detroit schools with a few magnet schools and a few charter schools. And so there's something to build on there, and we'll see. In the receivership process, you know, one of the things I think people sort of don't realize is that there are, when you look at all of the sort of aspects of receivership here, when you look at the workout, the bonds are, for the most part, not general obligation bonds. So, you know, there's basically 2 kinds of bonds and lots of complexity around that. But, you know, there's the general obligation as a municipality or state government. I'm obligated to pay for the bond. And then there are revenue bonds, which are based on particular cash flows and particular things. So the majority of those bonds are revenue bonds. And that means that they'll have claim on particular cash flows when the workout goes on, which will make this even more complex. And there are a variety of other small creditors. In Chapter 9, you should know that small credit vendors, people who do business with the city, are allowed to be paid, so that the receiver's actually paying them right now. That they're pretty much the only thing that's being paid right now, because the city basically has to do business. So if you agree with me, and you'd have to go there, that there's some okay things happening. I mean, this is a city with 700,000 people. We've got to figure out what to do, right? If you agree with me that there's the few things happening, there are these 2 massive pieces of uncertainty. And that will put, that really make it difficult to build from any of the points of strength that I talked about here. So the one is what we've talked about and what this is about, which is what's the workout going to look like, right? So, I mean, you know, you can imagine the morale in the city around this workout for people who are not sure what their pension what their pension is going to look like, or whether the contract they have as a public worker is a contract that will be held. And the second thing is, who's going to govern Detroit? So, look, a lot of people I've done work with in Detroit, they're actually pretty happy about the takeover, because they had no confidence in Detroit governance locally. And so the problem is, for the most part, you know, Bob talked about PICA, which came out of the 91 Philadelphia workout, which I agree is a great tool. But for the most part, we don't have a great understanding of what receivership mechanisms have to look like. You know, every state has a different kind of receivership. And most of them were invented in the 1930s. They mostly back bonds, or they give some technical assistance to get the budget process going. But for the most part, they don't do very much. And I think this is, you know, I can think of the Washington, D.C. Receivership, which was remarkably successful. I would agree that the 91 Philadelphia receivership was okay. There are many others that I just think have not been very successful. And so I think this is the uncertainty. The uncertainty is not simply what's the workout look like, but what's governance look like in Detroit when you come out of receivership, right? What will be different? You know, and this is a big problem. And these 2 uncertainties, the uncertainty of the private markets and the uncertainty of governance, I mean, that's basically what will keep things from moving. At a time, I would say, when there are some, private investor types that are sort of interested in Detroit and doing some interesting things. The guy from Quicken Loans and bought up all that real estate who's moving some businesses in, and there's some things that are exciting. And I think these two issues will be the things that will drive whether we have any possibility. And I'll stop right here. The reason it's watershed is because the pension fund issue and the retired health care benefit issue and the infrastructure deficit issue that Bob Inman noted, combined, those cans have been kicked down the road, and they can't get kicked down the road anymore. It's kind of, I just ran something at the Aspen Institute for a group of people that included 6 mayors. And it was great to sit in the room with the 6 mayors and talk about pension funds. And I mean, they know, so one or two of them are really doing a good job on it, but they know there's no political future in solving these problems. I mean, I just want to say, and I really understand that. It's really easy to preach about it, but there's actually no political future in doing it, right? It's much easier to not do it. And yet some are, some have been forced into it. We've got an understanding of what you have to do. There's a remarkable number of cities and states that have debt based on the pension fund liabilities. As you know, there are pension fund bonds that are just for borrowing against the borrowing. A piece of the private debt in Detroit are for derivatives, interest rate swaps, which was actually a big problem in Jefferson County. I'm not sure that anyone understood in either places what they were getting into. And so this is going to be a big issue, and I think it will have really great significance outside of Detroit for American cities and American governance. So hope.
Jeremy, I want to ask you a specific question, which is, how does bankruptcy solve this? And in a follow-on to that, who's going to eat the loss after bankruptcy?
Well, the numbers don't add up. So bankruptcy solves things by saying that here's what you're going to pay. The state said, the city said, when they filed for bankruptcy with the state receiver, they made an offer. And the offer was pennies on the dollar, depending on where you are. And then in bankruptcy court, you'll work it out. Now, either the pensioners will take the hit, and my guess is they'll take some hit. The pension fund, the investors will take hit. The banks are already making a play, 3 major banks, to not take a hit outside of the bankruptcy process. So it's a much smaller part of the debt, but it, to me, has great symbolic value. So the question, I think everybody's going to take a hit. Now, the problem is, what's it mean to take, and taxpayers will take a hit. What does it mean to take a hit? Well, if you take a hit, then that has reverberations, which is, does that mean that the state won't back it if you get into that? Does that mean the federal government won't back it? I mean, private pension funds have a federal insurer, right, a federal guarantor. Public pension funds have no guarantor. Now, maybe that's fine. They shouldn't have a guarantor. But if you don't have a guarantor, that means if it doesn't work, you have to do a workout, and somebody takes the hit. It's what happens in bankruptcies. So I think this is where we're in terra incognita. And because of the scale of it, and because, frankly, the position of the federal government, the inability to do very much about it. And there's where I think this conversation will be. You can return to this for many panels over the next year or two, sadly.
Is this a bellwether? I want to ask everybody on the panel. This is part lessons from the bankruptcy. Well, let's talk about just not before the bankruptcy, lessons from the decline. Is the decline of Detroit leading to bankruptcy a bellwether that signals, that goes along with, perhaps not as severe, but decline elsewhere? And will this declining cities elsewhere, will they too, are they likely to see this as the way out, or is there something specific about the law of the state or Detroit that makes this unique? Anyone want to weigh in on that?
I think the one thing we learned from the New York City crisis back in the mid-'70s was that the marketplace was very quick to pick up on the fact that the crisis was a New York-specific problem. This wasn't endemic to all cities throughout the U.S., and therefore all cities faced big new risks in their borrowing. It was about 3 or 4 months in which interest rates rose for everybody, and then they just settled back down to where they belonged based on the underlying risks. So I think Detroit is a Detroit problem, and brought about for many of the reasons that I think we've all clarified. Tom stressing and Gilles stressing the one industry nature of this, the manufacturing nature of this. I've tried to stress the political environment that perhaps the economics drove to find the deficit strategy so attractive. I'll throw out one more attribute of Detroit, and you can choose to treat it as a generalization applicable elsewhere or not. But I'm, as an economist, of course, a big believer in getting the incentives right. And I'll tell you who has the right incentives in cities is landowners, property owners, homeowners. Those are the guys who are going to pay attention. They're going to pay attention to unfunded debts, unfunded pensions, and unfunded capital stocks. Why? Because when all those debts fall due, the value of their assets go down, as Gilles pointed out. Detroit did not have, though I don't know the details, Tom may, or Jeremy may, home ownership as a fraction of the population, I suspect, was falling over all of this period. That shifted the voters' incentives away from asset management, paying attention to the long run, and very much towards the short run, high discount rate kinds of environments. You don't find that in other cities, I think. I think other cities have much stronger home base and asset value base. New York City, it's an asset-driven public finance. I mean, let's not fool each other on this one. Why was Bloomberg and all the other mayors so successful in the last bunch of years? Because they pay attention to asset values. And that's led to good governance. And I'll make the argument, perhaps overstating it for the point to be stressed, is that when you got a stake in the game, you pay attention to the guys managing the particular outcomes. And the stake in the game in cities is owning property. So I think getting the incentives right, and I would suggest that perhaps Detroit was a confluence of bad incentives, bad economics, and as a result, bad public finance.
Tom, do you want to comment on the political economy? And we'll go to Jeremy after.
Sure. I take Bob's point about home ownership, but Detroit's had a pretty high rate of home ownership certainly relative to New York and relative to a lot of big industrial cities. The problem is that the real estate's worth very, very little. One can buy a house in Detroit today for somewhere between $7,000 and $15,000 on an eighth of an acre lot, a quarter acre lot. New York, by contrast, doesn't have very high property ownership, at least by individual homeowners. I mean, there are, of course, the commercial property owners, which are a substantial part of the New York story. And this is, I think, where you're on the mark, Bob, because Detroit has a very small base of commercial and industrial property owners because of the devastation of the city's commercial and industrial base. But to put another economist on the table who's not in the room, Ed Glazer argues that one of the problems in Detroit is because real estate is so inexpensive that it's sticky. People don't have that much of an incentive to pick up and move, even when they may have reasons to pick up and go elsewhere. And then you combine that with the fact that Detroit is an intensely racially segregated metropolitan area with a core city that's 80% black. What it means is there aren't a lot of mobility options in the metropolitan area. That's changing. Some of the inner ring suburbs, the places that basically look a lot like Detroit in terms of their housing stock, have been attracting minorities leaving the city, mostly African Americans. Most of the population loss between 2000 and 2010, Detroit lost 25% of its population between 2000 and 2010, were African Americans moving to secondhand suburbs on the periphery of the city. Detroit did lose whites between 2000 and 2010 as well, about 50,000 of the 100,000 or so whites that were living there in 2000. So the white population is very small in Detroit. And one other factor to throw out on the table, and Detroiters were optimistic. I'm a native Detroiter. I mean, Jeremy in some ways is maybe more typical of a Detroiter than anyone else here. But one of the reasons to be pessimistic for Detroit is that it is a very low immigrant city. Detroit's got a minuscule immigrant population compared to many of its counterpart cities. And immigration has played a really critical role in the transformation of neighborhoods, of real estate, of business districts in many other metropolitan areas in the United States. Detroit has not benefited from that, in part because there's not a good reason for folks moving there unless they want to buy houses for $10,000. So There is, for example, a significant Bangladeshi population that's mostly moved from Queens and Brooklyn. And have basically taken over and revitalized the taxi industry in Detroit. Because despite the fact Detroit's an auto city, a lot of the population doesn't have access to reliable car transportation, and they moved into that niche. But we're talking about, in the 4 digits of that population, very, very small. And so immigration, I think, can be both a cause and an effect of urban transformation.
Jeremy, did you want to respond?
No, I was, just a few things. So I agree that the private markets look at it as a Detroit problem, but I would say if you look at bond pricings right now, Bob, they look at it a little bit as a Michigan problem. So there has been some uptick in bonds on other Michigan debt, and it hasn't meant it anywhere else. So I would just because of the role, just because of this question of what does the state do if something comes out. So I would say it's a little bit more than that, but not much. So I agree with you, the general point. I agree with Tom. I mean, Detroit's actually had a high homeownership rate, and I do know from doing research around different cities that very often, you have in Philadelphia's like this. You have very, very large populations of pretty poor people but have a house, and they don't have the ability to keep up the house, and they become prey to all kinds of lending, operations that are problematic. Detroit had a huge foreclosure problem. It actually had quite a bit of it had a price bubble running up to, believe it or not, up to 2007, not by, Las Vegas standards, but it had a bubble in a couple places. And, you meet people who bought a home at a pretty high, relatively high value in Detroit, and then went down to 10 or 15,000. So there were people that were holding. So I do think that many of the cities, and in fact, some of the hottest parts of Philadelphia from a market perspective are places with high levels of rental properties because they're upscale rental properties. And so I think it's and that would be true of parts of Boston and obviously Manhattan. There has been a little bit, I'll try to be optimistic again, by the numbers you're right in terms of immigration. There has been Middle Eastern immigration, which has had an effect in Detroit. I do some work in the supermarket world, and by the way, a Whole Foods opened in Midtown Detroit recently. It wasn't a gigantic Whole Foods. It was they're experimenting with a 20,000 square foot urban, but it's a real Whole Foods, and it's opened and doing great. And the grocery store industry is actually sort of largely controlled by Chaldeans, the Chaldean community, Iraqi Christians. And so it's actually some real diversity in some areas, and with the sort of immigrant entrepreneurial character. And so, I just throw on my optimistic hat again. I'm trying to.
So back to the lessons for others. Harrisburg was on the verge of bankruptcy, but the state governor and forced, I understand, a negotiation so that Harrisburg did not go into bankruptcy. So is there something different about Michigan? And I understand the agreement in Harrisburg. I mean, there's some additional support from the state, not much, but obviously Michigan is not supporting Detroit now, I guess. They're not throwing in lots of resources. They're allowing the bankruptcy. They're pushing for the bankruptcy. Is that something about Michigan? And a related question is, and this is for Bob, this question probably is for Jeremy, others may want to weigh in, is why doesn't the municipal bond market do a better job of policing this?
Oh, that.
Who wants to deal with what first? You want to start, Bob, with policing?
Yeah, I think think of what the process is all about. The guys who know what's going on buy the bond and sell the bond. So out of their portfolios. Yeah. The guys who have no idea what's happening in Detroit are dentists in Iowa who bought the bond. And suppose that one dentist in Iowa goes, ooh, my goodness, look at how terrible this market is going. I'm going to sell my bond. Well, you got to get all the dentists all over the United States to decide the bond is in bad place. So what you've got is really diffused information. The guys who know are doing the deal and they're pulling out. The guys holding the bonds, it's just really hard to find out what's going on in terms of the public finances of these places. I joke that there's something called the general fund, which is, of course, what the balanced budget rules all apply to, and that's where you see the action. That's the police and the fire and the sanitation and the sewage. But what do? They take the sanitation and the sewage out of the general fund and create a fund for sanitation and a fund for sewage and run deficits in those funds. It's really hard to figure out what's going on in the terms of the overall fiscal position of a city. And you get the guys who have the ability and the incentives to pay attention, they sell the bonds. And the guys who end up holding the paper, it's really hard for them
Bob,
to figure out
but what is the role of insurance of municipal debt in this? Does that take away the incentives?
The bottom line is the value of the credit is the value of the insurer. So, now I've got to evaluate whatever all the letters are. MIMBA or whatever it would be. You got to end up doing the same thing with the insurer that you would have to have done for Detroit or Illinois or Pennsylvania. It's just it's a market in which information is diffused, hard to collect, and you need a sophisticated, efficient marginal buyer, and you don't have that.
Well, then what is disciplining this? This is a question. I just came back from a conference that we convened on city governance across the world and perhaps the need for municipal finance, which is only in the U.S. And the question to me was, tell us how and why municipal finances work so well. And I was saying, okay, I'll call Bob up. But it sounds like Bob doesn't think so.
I'll just quickly say, I think the places that work well are the places that have citizens who have a vested interest in paying attention to what's going on in their cities. Back to my point in pushing property owners, the guy who owns the rental building is the guy with the vested interest. And those guys are pretty Donald Trump for all of your
So it's citizens, but citizens have a very hard time tracking the niceties, and the owners, obviously, the details of pension, right? Pension funds. And so is there a broad need for pension fund reform so that cities can become more transparent? Okay.
How about defined contribution plans?
And there's been some improvements in that recently by the accounting standards. So there have been some slight improvements in that. And actually, it was those improvements which sort of forced cities to take things on as liabilities that they hadn't taken on before, which actually created some of the, oh my God, is this really where we are?
Which is the question that I was just about to ask you before, Jeremy, which is why Detroit, why now? Some argue that Detroit didn't need to go into bankruptcy, actually.
Well, that's the argument that unions and pensioners and many others will make. Look, on a cash basis, Detroit last year, and if I have this number wrong, I apologize, but just on a cash basis, without funding many of the things it had to fund, was still losing about $350 million in the budget.
Well, that sounds like a need.
At the end of the day, look, states and cities, I can't say this, somebody associated with the Federal Reserve, they can't do what you can do in the federal government, right? They've got these other issues. They do it in the way that Bob talked about it.
But there's a limit to that.
There's a limit to that. So I do think at some point there are things you can put in place, but I think, governance at the end of the day, and you could have said this about the financial crisis on some level, that at the end of the day, governance becomes the question. And the question is, why don't you have better governance? And how do we, look, if all of a sudden take the example, which I probably shouldn't, I'll get in trouble, of the School Reform Commission in Philadelphia.
By all means.
Yeah, I'd walk right into it. You've got 5 volunteers, right, who are on top of a $3 billion, now about a $2.6 billion budget, very complex. And we sort of assume, and they're great people, terrific people, but we assume that those 5 volunteers, without any staffing of any real kind, of any significant kind, who have not, in a district that hasn't had the ability to do the kind of maneuvering it needed to do to fix itself over the past decade and more, that those people are going to be able to both understand and figure out how to work these things out. And the truth is, this is a big problem, and it's a problem that's coming home to roost all over the country in different forms.
I'm going to turn to the audience. Before I do that, I want to ask everyone on the panel to weigh in on one of 2 questions. Question 1 is, what are the lessons for Philadelphia from the bankruptcy of Detroit, if any, or turning it around, what are the lessons of cities that have gone through this, maybe not bankruptcy, but other severe disasters like New Orleans, for Detroit? And if we want to broaden it out more very broadly, as has been opined by someone on the panel, many cities now are growing in the U.S. that were declining. Just in response to a comment of, forgotten who on the panel, started listing them. Cities that were looking like they were in long-term decline: Boston, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, all turned around. So lessons for Detroit from New Orleans growing again, from these cities, and lessons from Detroit, a city obviously on the verge of bankruptcy, for what Philadelphia should not do or should do now to avoid such a fate. Either one, both. Let's start, Tom.
It's hard to draw direct parallels to Detroit from previous bankruptcies or serious financial crises. I think of, say, New York or Cleveland. These are cities that faced situations in many respects as grave as Detroit is today, but in a very different political climate. In a climate when the federal government, in the case of New York, stepped in with very substantial resources to help the city get through its fiscal crisis. Cleveland had support from the state of Ohio. Detroit is essentially being left to fend for itself in bankruptcy court. This is contextually a really big difference. So it's unclear to me in terms of looking at other bankrupt municipalities in the past how the Detroit situation might play out. And the current bankruptcies, I mean, Jefferson County is the closest, but it's really a lot smaller and in many respects simpler than the situation that's going to play out in Detroit. In terms of growth and revitalization, a lot of people in Detroit are going for Jeremy's argument that bringing cultural producers, revitalizing the downtown, attracting hipsters to the Midtown area is going to be the ticket for Detroit's transformation. Thus far, those investments and the repopulation in those neighborhoods is infinitesimally small. Midtown would fit into a few blocks in Brooklyn. It's going to be a long time before Detroit has enough of those artists and high-tech people to really turn the city around. The fundamental question for Detroit is, what about the 630 or 640,000 or so mostly working class, some poor African Americans living in the neighborhoods that by and large are not benefiting from the trickle down of revitalization in Midtown and downtown. Now, the one bright part of the Detroit story is Detroit, like every big major metro in the Northeast and Midwest and many in the rest of the country, the top employers, higher education, hospitals, and government, right? Meds and eds. Right. Unfortunately, meds and eds in Detroit are Henry Ford, the Detroit Medical Center, and Wayne State. I mean, the other colleges and universities in Detroit are really small and aren't really major economic generators for the city. But Detroit has gotten through the last 40 years or so on the power of those sectors of the economy. And as we think about revitalizing Detroit, we need to think about strategies like some that Jeremy mentioned in Midtown that are bolstering the capacity of the hospitals and the university, because they are really important employers for Detroit and will be an essential ingredient for the city's revitalization. Those jobs in hospitals and higher education are everyone from janitors and orderlies all the way up to neurosurgeons and economics professors. And so there's a lot of diversity in the workforces, and Detroit Detroit needs to rely on those in the future.
Bob, lessons for Philadelphia or other comments?
Well, lessons from Detroit, I think the basic one is other cities should pay attention. This could happen to you if you screw it up. So I think it's a pretty obvious lesson, but as Jeremy stressed, governance, finding the institutions and the incentives that will lead people to pay attention. I think it's the important, for me anyway, the important lesson from Detroit. Lessons for Detroit, I would say don't be afraid to be small, because you are going to be small. I can't believe that city's going to be any bigger than 300,000 or 400,000 in equilibrium.
Down from its current.
700.
Yeah,
it's from about 700 now.
Yeah, exactly. I don't see. I haven't done the details on Detroit, but listening to my other panelists, I don't see anything that's going to make it a big home run population-wise city.
Except maybe for the poor who are living there have no...
Pittsburgh worked its way from 600,000 to 300,000, but it took them from 1970 to 1990. And the way they did it was they had some darn good mayors paying attention to the budget. And so then the meds and the eds could begin to flourish in a reasonably sane and well-managed public environment. So I think the lessons for Detroit is you're going to be smaller, figure out how to make the transition.
So before we go to Gilles, thank you, Bob. We haven't spent much time on that very, very critical issue that was brought up by Tom, that the city's footprint is very large, even now for the population. We have several experts in the audience. I'm going to ask Professor Poindexter Phillips to comment on that very question of the use of land after we go through the panel. Gilles, comments on lessons from lessons for?
Well, Detroit, I think, was the really, really bad kid in the class. Philadelphia is another bad one. So I think there was something pretty unique about...
No, we're actually... Yeah, wait a minute. We got you here. How bad can we be?
Are you an Eagles fan yet?
Not yet.
Well, I'm looking at the numbers. That's all I know. That's all I've learned.
You're rational. That's the problem.
So we're not very far, but I don't think, I think there's a lot of structural issues that lots of North American cities will need to address about unfunded pension liabilities and all that, all what Bob has mentioned, but it's not on the same scale. So I think, Detroit was unique on being this really grand scale problem, this really bad shock that happened in the last 10 years, leading to a huge bankruptcy, and there will be blood everywhere. That's sad. Yes, like Bob, I think the only way out for Detroit is to learn to grow much smaller. Small is beautiful. The problem is that the layout of the city, I've been there all 24 hours of my life once, but from what I've seen, and again from the density numbers that I've computed, it looks like it has a long way to go because it's a huge city with basically very few people and bound to get even much less. So in terms of coming back, really, that's why I like the comparison with England, because I think this group of 7 cities is more comparable to Detroit. There's a number of places in this country which have been declining, some of them for a very long time, like St. Louis, like New Orleans. I think the only 2 examples that have come back really after being really, really low are Boston and Seattle. But Detroit or no Boston, no Seattle. I cannot well compare that to them. And the other thing we need to pay attention to, it's true that lots of North American cities have been in decline for 20 or 30 years from 1960 plus to 1980 plus. But this was mostly a decline of the central city at the time when metropolitan areas were growing nonetheless more or less everywhere. And those guys at the bottom of the class, even the metro area was actually losing population. So Detroit, MA is also losing population, so that's bad.
Back to the underlying economics of manufacturing cars, which is draining the metropolitan area, not only the city itself, which puts Detroit in a class by itself.
Yes.
Or, Jeremy, other thoughts on this?
Yeah, just one quickly. So when you're, for people who are poor, understandably, and I say this not as a criticism in any way, for people who are poor, the tendency is to look at government as a service provider, as a form of service, right? And in that sense, the political culture, understandably, becomes a kind of redistributionist political culture, and which is understandable, and the needs are there. You look at, so the question for a lot of American cities, and I'll get back to Detroit, is how do you have political leadership? So American cities like Philadelphia are really extraordinary because of the intensity of the co-location of moments and places of growth with extremely high levels of poverty at the same time. And so it's the ability in civil society and among political leadership to manage that co-location, to be able to be both pro-growth and understand how to manage and work with communities of poverty to help rebuild the sort of bridge institutions like schools and others that will provide some kind of social mobility, which were the traditional social mobility things. For the most part, I think many American cities haven't had that kind of leadership. Now, that doesn't solve, even if you had it, wouldn't solve the historical problems of lack of diversification, of race, which Tom mentioned and should be, I would agree with. That's an extraordinarily racially segmented region. But we are going to have to, if we're going to solve big urban problems in America, we're going to have a narrative and a set of practices that manage this co-location so that we can be both generative and deal with services. And the big issue in Detroit, what it's so symptomatic of, is if you don't fix the balance sheet, you can't provide services. So if you go through if you did the numbers, if you just, there's somebody said if you did the numbers in Detroit, and if you don't fix anything, which is fixing will be, as you said, blood on the table, whatever if you don't fix anything, then by 2017, as much as 65% of the budget in Detroit could be paying for liabilities. If you took now that's not sustainable in terms of core public services, which also gets to the issue of kind of how we pay for local public goods, right? Which is a very complicated issue in the U.S. and is different than many other places, which says a lot. But I would just say that this is the lesson here, is that we're going to have a different kind of political leadership that's going to get it, that, the transformations that have happened in the world in the last 30 or 40 years say that if you have no workforce skills, you no longer get a premium for being an American. The premium's not there in terms of wages. It's sort of over in that sense. And so this is a very, very difficult message to be able to deliver as part of the reconstituting of institutions which can help provide some measure of social mobility. I mean, I know it sounds sort of abstract, but I think this is to me, this is a central issue, a central proposition. It's why I sometimes find it so difficult to deal with either the right or the left.
A profound point, and one I know you're writing a book on, which we're going to be looking forward to.
Yeah.
Professor Phillips. I want to talk about the land situation and whether there are specific things that can be done on zoning.
Run on the decline
Zone for
platform.
decline. Yeah, I can see it out there.
Because the old grade zoning does not allow for at least stabilization into a new normal, like Pittsburgh or Boston, who have really, taken it on the chin and have come out probably okay, but much smaller in terms of population than they used to be.
Questions? Thank you. Yes, here. Please identify yourself. Thank you.
Very nice presentation across the board. The three areas and I especially like the notion that you raised about the nation and cities in general. The United Nations generally, and many urbanists understand cities as the central place for the future of humanity, really, all economic and social activity. In other words, there's great migration going on globally. I think the United States is cities go down. That's what you're seeing. And it's really, I think Detroit is really the edge of a big problem. At the regional level, what you see are the suburbs, the surrounding cities, are under incredible pressure now. We talked about Philadelphia, the extensive systems that support the suburbs, like highways and sewers and schools and all distributed, carry enormous costs with them. That the declining asset base that is not supportable by the declining income base is affecting suburbs as well. And so the regional factor of cities is actually under great stress. And the last part is that to make this even worse, really, we have to get out of looking at cities from the way they used to do things. Cities really need to be reconfigured as enterprises so that how they make money, how they bring together the private enterprise and the public sector interests to reconfigure opportunity and production, I think, is a necessary thing. A guy like at Harvard, Robert, can't remember his name, a consultant, talks about the crisis of capitalism. But the bottom line is, I think those are
Bob Putnam.
yeah. So, thank you.
Thank you. I don't think
I'm
that's
just going to say something really brief, which is the growing attraction of cities around the world is a large part because of their density. And Detroit is a 20th century American city. It's not very dense. And one of the obstacles I think that it faces is that the sprawl geographically and the fact that it doesn't have many of those places that attract agglomeration is going to be a problem over time.
This is an important thing to bring up. Cities own most of the land. They own all the streets. They usually come into possession of all the private land through,
that's a very important point of the land ownership.
and they own all the infrastructure. So they are the perfect people to be doing long-term development strategies.
can't do it.
And what we see now is a lack of a
And they're going to have to do that, particularly given your challenges that you so well put out. I'm going to take a question way in the back, and then this question over here for this woman, then I'll switch to this side. Way in the back, please identify yourself.
Good evening. My name is Ken Stipe. My question is more about this land use. These land use notions. I'm glad we got to them towards the end of this great presentation. We talked about the idea that Detroit is failing as an inability to clear, and one of the ideas being that it won't clear until the last person leaves or the last building is raised. But of course, there's another way to bring around this clearing effect, which is to reduce the demand for public services by reducing the amount of people who demand those services, and that would be to take some land off of Detroit, make it smaller, physically make it smaller. And I too am a fan of incentives, and I know that the governor, Rick Snyder, had offered an incentive for consolidation towards localities in Michigan who can save money by consolidating services. I'm just curious if any of you folks can think of some interesting planning or financing mechanisms with which we can take some of Detroit Place offline. It's clearly politically untenable for no one's going to elect a mayor that's going to just say, sorry, we're not going to give you any services, but we can reduce the police response rate down for 50 minutes, from 50 minutes, if we can not have the police having to respond to these desolate blocks where there's one house.
Good question. So take land offline. What I'm going to do is get a series of questions and come back. Question over here.
My name is Rachel Meadows. My question is, do any of you know how many of the current Detroit population are pensioners, and what percentage of the population are pensioners? Because my concern is that if they are getting cents on the dollar, then obviously they're losing their entire income that they rely on. So they've gone as that $19,000 that they rely on, and then they become incredibly high-need citizens.
It's a good question. Got it. We'll come back to that. Yes, over here in front row.
My name is Mark Armstrong, and I want to make a quick point and open up for discussion, and that is that it's our tendency to look at labor costs as being the source of the problem. Many of the things that we've talked about tonight have been associated with that. My home, San Francisco, what's been in the news is the new Bay Bridge that was built, $6.4 billion. It's another $6 billion in debt servicing costs to pay for the financing for that. And yet,
Do you have a suggestion about how to reduce debt servicing costs?
Public banks, that's what
Public banks. Got it. All right, we'll come back to that question.
that they finance their own debt.
Got it. All right, come back to that question.
What industry do you think Detroit can build on? Obviously, if the automotive industry isn't going to be going forward, what other industries do you think?
Thank you. And we have some of that. I want to come back, but I want to say I absolutely agree with you. We have a book on, and actually I think there's a lot of positive things to learn from the comeback of New Orleans. There are two more questions we can take, unfortunately. Over here, thank you, and then back there, and that's it. Go ahead.
Jeff Ornstein. Tom SUGRUE raised a really important question. What about the other 650,000 people in Detroit who aren't in Midtown or downtown? I think it's the most relevant question we should be asking about Philadelphia. Right? We have two cities here, the 100,000 of us who live in Center City or University City who actually know where Penn is, and then everybody else. So I think our anchor sector in Philadelphia is a grossly underutilized resource. We have 150,000 direct employees, 200,000 plus students here. Their procurement power to drive an entire revitalization, in my view, of both the service and production economy here. And I think Penn has given us some reasons to think that's possible, but I think we've only scratched the surface. So I'm wondering if there are lessons back and forth between Detroit and Philadelphia to help lead that huge piece of the pie.
And on anchors, we're doing an event later on anchors and eds and meds, and procurement I know is on the table. So come to that. Others may be interested as well. Question back there?
Because what I was missing from the discussion is, what about the rich suburbs of Detroit, which essentially, could help, resolve some of the debt problems, which is not being discussed about, and also the public funding cuts that come from state level commission of government. There would be an alternative to cutting retirees' benefits.
So I heard about the rich suburbs, but I think we heard here also the suburbs are somewhat under the gun as well. So let me just summarize quickly the questions that we heard. I'm sorry, I do have to cut it off at this point. We heard take land off the market. We heard consolidate services as part of that. We heard question about cents on the dollar for pensions. How much will pensions be reduced? And in fact, will that hurt the city because then we'll need more support? We heard a plea for public banks. We heard the potential role of eds and meds and other industry for Detroit. Let's start with Jeremy and come this way. Any thoughts on any of these as potential solutions for the crisis?
Well, I just would say a couple things about the politics of this, which is that it's very difficult to consolidate land because of the political cost of doing that, even in situations that seem so obvious. And having been part of trying to do that in Philadelphia in a different time, I can just tell you it's really hard. So what an emergency situation does is create the opportunity to do some of that, perhaps, but nobody's simply going to cut off services. I mean, they've talked about it and it's declined, and so people will gradually opt out. But for the most part, this is, politically difficult, and Detroit has a large councilmatic system where, people distribute the way a council person distributes. That's what they're going to do, and so it makes it, nobody runs on a let's fold up the tent political strategy, right? And so the problem is, where do you get the political will to do that, right? And obviously an emergency and a crisis give you maybe the political will to do it, but you still need the mechanisms to do it. And I think what we don't have is an urban policy that really, for the most part, has differentiated cities with respect to different kinds of cities, that has given us different kinds of tools and different kinds of resources based on the type of city. And so I think it's made it really difficult to act that way. And for the most part, even federal money for the most part is sort of compliance driven more than performance driven. And it makes very little differentiation. They're formula based in terms of demography and poverty, but they're not based on sort of the market potential or the strategic potential of cities and how the money therefore should be used. And I think we're pretty far from being able to face that, and that really, that worries me. So sorry to throw in something pessimistic.
Well, I think yes, going smaller is probably the only way to go. So you want to replace dilapidated blocks by parks. But yes, this is really easy way to say that, but then how do you do it? I think it's a really interesting problem, but it's part of a broader set of issues that economists call land assembly, and we know it's really hard to do. So here it's more like land reassembly, I guess. So you have a block or 10 blocks, and you have whatever, 2,000 landowners, and it's going to be a really hard problem. Like the city would like to be able to get this back for free, but there will always be some smart guys who say, I'm going to hold you up here because actually I want to keep living here, you need to give me services and so on and so forth. And that's a really hard problem. How can we solve it while still being in a regime of good property rights is not a trivial question. I think it's a really interesting problem. But so maybe with the urgency of the situation, they will come up with new creative solutions because the existing solutions like land banks and all of that, they're sort of working, but they're not working great. On the social issue, so let me be very, very French here. I'm always amazed in countries when a big part of the social safety net is done at the very local level, like in this country. Because the French person in me plus the rational economists say it should be a federal problem, it's a national problem, and this is more than a place issue, it's a people's issue, and people who are really at the bottom, there should be some mechanisms at the national level for them that goes over and above the dysfunctionalities of City Hall in Detroit. But I'm not going to change the system here.
Next on your agenda. Bob?
Just very quickly, the vision of labor that was offered in our first comment, I find exceptionally attractive, and only to echo Gilles' comment that national government does poverty and income redistribution, the regional government does infrastructure, and the local government is a business. It's set up to be an enterprise, to help production improve. And I would make the contention that the importance of cities to developing economies is the potential to be productive centers for economic activity. So this division that you offered in your summary comment I find really quite attractive. The dilemma, of course, is the national government isn't going to take over the poverty problem. But I do think put it this way bluntly, if poverty is not an issue for cities like Detroit or Philadelphia, and the resources are given to the city to remove that obligation, the city can become, if spent wisely, can become a much more efficient and productive center. Then take the next step. Agglomeration allows job opportunities for the region as a whole, and there's a potential deal to be done, at least within the metro area, for sharing of poverty expenditures. I've thought about this. I've been bold enough to suggest that proposal for Philadelphia, and my neighbor in Swarthmore came up to me and accused me of being an absolute fool, and he would never vote for my proposal. But he could have killed you.
There we go. I have to follow on Bob. I think, in some ways, the roles of each of these levels of government is suboptimal, to say the least. And Detroit is a classic case of federal withdrawal from support of the most vulnerable populations, a state withdrawal from a place that they view, and to put it colloquially, as the Great Satan. The suburbs' disinterest in the fate of the city, even though the two are fundamentally linked, and the city's lack of resources and lack of administrative capacity to be able to deal with all the problems that are on its plate. In terms of land use, let me say Detroit has been involved in a de facto experiment in reallocating resources in the city. It's been closing schools, like lots of other cities have. It has, in effect, been withdrawing police service from parts of the city without calling it that, because it simply can't deliver to sections of the city right now. But the plans to reallocate the population to accomplish density in the city face huge obstacles. I would say probably obstacles that are impossible to overcome. For one, Governor Snyder in Michigan has proposed this, put people together in viable neighborhoods and sections of the city. Imagine the amount of resources just to buy out the people with the $10,000 or $20,000 houses, times the segment of the city living there. Michigan and Detroit do not have the resources to subsidize that kind of agglomeration, which means there have to be other mechanisms that haven't yet, I don't think, been fully imagined to put in place. Finally, pensioners. It is, I'll be blunt about this, unconscionable for a bankruptcy settlement to put the brunt of bearing the costs on folks who are making $19,000 or $31,000 a year without Social Security, barring some backup. Jefferson County did fairly well by its pensioners, relatively speaking, and I have to hope that as the bankruptcy gets resolved in Detroit, that pensioners aren't primarily the ones who are going to have to take the haircut because it'll have devastating effects. Many of Detroit's pensioners, it should be said, don't live in Detroit. Right? Detroit's workforce was overwhelmingly white into the 1970s and still doesn't reflect the demography of the city. So a lot of the pensioners are living in northern Michigan, they're living in the suburbs, they're living in Florida. So the cost of the haircut on those pensions is going to be distributed really widely. It will impact Detroit, but not as profoundly as it might if the demography were different.
Not a Detroit problem, but nonetheless a human problem. Before we thank the panelists, I want to take note of upcoming events. On November 11th, we will hear how urban design can be useful for shrinking cities in a talk on the city after abandonment. On October 31st, we will hear about the power of eds and meds. I think we should be grateful for Penn and other eds and meds that help Philadelphia. We'll talk about that across cities, how urban universities can help. On October 14th, we'll hear Voices from Detroit, Voices of Hope, Despair, and Resilience in an urban book talk, Driving Detroit, The Quest for Respect in the Motor City. And then on a hopeful note, Ed Bacon, his remarkable contribution to Philadelphia, the building of modern Philadelphia, a book about his life and what his impact on Philadelphia's good planning has been. You have that panel. Please join us. I know that our co-sponsor of this event also has events coming up. Tom SUGRUE of the Social Science and Policy Forum. Tom, do you want to make some comments on that?
Yes, the Social Science and Policy Forum is bringing together a series of forums and workshops this year on immigration and its impact in terms of the law, public policy, urban revitalization, questions of citizenship. It's going to be a really exciting series of events this year, bringing together scholars and policymakers from around the world. We're kicking off with a large public event on immigration reform, past and present, which will be held at the National Museum of American Jewish History on the 4th of October. Information about that forum, as well as our events throughout the year, are available on a handout. If you didn't pick it up, you can get it on the table right outside the door.
And also you can get it at both our websites. Please join me in thanking this extraordinary panel.